and the scrutiny that we've hoped for from himself and the department, and in the same vein we wish his successor Anne-Marie Trevelyan well and hope we can engage in the same positive spirit. Anyway, back to today's session. Active Travel England. We have two witnesses. Perhaps I could ask them to introduce themselves for the record.
Thank you. Good morning. Thank you, Chair. Chris Boardman, the Active Travel Commissioner for England.
And Danny Williams, the relatively new CEO for Active Travel England.
Well, good morning to both of you. Thanks very much for being with us. We're really keen to talk all things walking, wheeling and cycling and other modes that fit within your remit. During today's session, we want to get a good feel for what Active Travel England is going to do, your aims, your objectives, how you're being set up, what you can do to actually meet targets, your views around current trajectory on targets, and maybe some of the pointers for us where you need other agencies and bodies to step up to the plate to be able to deliver. So I hope it will be a good exchange of ideas. I'm sure with the two of you knowing you, it will be. I'll start. We want to just look at the establishing of Active Travel England, ask a few questions there, and then we'll move on to other sections. So a sort of general open, I did note on social media that you gave us a suggested question. We thought, no, it was a good one, but if we did that for everyone, then we'd probably sort of be replaced by a robot on social media. So it may well be that you give the same answer you're going to give anyway, but I just wanted to know in what ways you think walking, wheeling, cycling is going to benefit from the establishment of Active Travel England.
I don't know if you're going to want to direct the questions or you just...
Well, we'll throw it over to the two of you. Working as a team, I'm sure you'll decide how you want to divvy it up. But Chris, why don't you start?
I think the climate has changed, excuse the pun, the climate has changed quite dramatically, I think, over the last few years, and globally, not just nationally, people have realised that active travel is a big part of a sustainable future. And I don't just mean that in terms of climate change, actually the ability to have a sustainable transport system, an equitable transport system. We know that 31% of fewer young people are now owning cars. It's not how they want to spend their available disposable income, and they're looking for alternatives. And the benefits, as we know, for health and on all the other areas that active travel brings are now pushing further and further up the agenda, and that's proved very much the case throughout the pandemic. I think right now we also have a duty to ensure that people have access to cheap transport, and active travel provides all of that for the local journeys, the vast majority of which are less than 5 miles, huge, around about a third are less than a mile. So it is a part of our future as part of an integrated transport system. And I think now is the perfect and important time for Active Travel England to exist. And I welcome the government's policy on it. It's very robust, the gear change strategy, and our job is to deliver it. 50% of all journeys cycled or walked in towns and cities by 2030.
And sort of in a nutshell, really, I mean, how do you think the formation of Active Travel England will go towards delivering those aims and achievements?
So if I pick that up from a sort of more operational perspective, I think if you look back at investment in walking, wheeling, cycling in the UK, what's been in England in the last decade, it's been fairly hit and miss. So there's a pocket of money here, pockets of money there, and when you look around, that results in pockets of excellence around the country, but it's a bit stop and start. So what we have is a mode of forms of transport that are sometimes well funded, sometimes not well funded, and as a result you've got people who are sometimes part of that and sometimes not part of that. What Active Travel England does is it gives us an opportunity to actually get a centre of excellence and start to do things properly with a long-term plan and sort of a robust commitment to making that happen. And you can start to see that as we start to talk to people about joining us. There are some fantastic people all around the country, but we've never switched them on as a kind of cohesive force. So that's the first time we can do that.
If I might just add some numbers to that, as an example, in London, where you've had sustained investment for active travel, there's been a 25% increase on pre-pandemic levels in people getting around by bike and on foot. And in Greater Manchester, where I've been working with the MER for 5 years, going back from 2015 levels, it's now up 40%. So where we have really good examples in this country of where we've had sustained investment, people have chosen to ride and walk.
And I don't want to canter over the brief because we are going to look at how you'll work with stakeholders, but just to set the scene and sort of throughout this, I mean, do you see your role and not just as sort of encouraging and enabling, but also auditing those other bodies and ultimately acting as a bit of a stick to make sure that they deliver it?
It's carrot and stick, right? So,
but both?
Yeah.
Hit them with a big carrot.
Yeah.
So there's definitely a lot of love. So what we need to do is find ways that everybody who wants to can win, right? So not everybody does want to be frank, but those that do, we really want to support them with toolkits, with resources, with advice, with guidance and so on. And some the stick element is really just a sort of, hey, look, this is how you're doing compared to other people. Why don't you think about doing some more of this?
Yeah, and later on we're going to come to the point about what you do to those that actually just will not move, but we'll save that for as we go through. Just sticking on the establishment of the body, I'm going to go to Gavin Newlands.
Thanks so much, Chair. So we've got a new Prime Minister has assumed office as of yesterday. What commitments, obviously we know that they've already been asked for their opinions on active travel, but what commitments for active travel are you hoping to see from Liz Truss?
I think to start with continuity. We have a really robust strategy, as I mentioned, in gear change. It's integrated with the rest of transport. The means to deliver it is in place, which I assume we will get into. So I think continuity. And as I mentioned, to reiterate what I said at the start, I don't think there's ever been a more important time for us to ensure people have the option to drive less, to have that choice, and it's a viable and attractive option. So I think continuity is the main thing that I would be looking for, and I'm very hopeful that will be the case.
On continuity, on the way this morning I passed a bus that I think the policy launched today on a citizens' assembly on how to deal with the climate crisis. To you, from an active travel point of view and modal shift point of view, does that represent a concern and opportunity?
Sorry, I missed the first part of the question.
There was a bus promoting a citizens' assembly or something akin to that on how to deal with the climate crisis that the Prime Minister will be promoting. Does that concern you, or is that an opportunity?
No, I mean, certainly in terms of buses, I think that these are all things that have to work together. And just to digress slightly, I mean, I've spent 4 years working in Greater Manchester, and the latter part of my job was integrating transport, and the integrated offer is absolutely key. And in terms of the climate crisis, I think the beauty of the product that we have is, to use that terminology, is pick a crisis. This is part of the solution, and I think it's very robust. Whichever way we come to look at it right now, it's cost. I think it is, people need a cheap way to get to works, to shops, and ideally to schools, to not have to do the school run, to be able to shrink the family car ownership down by one. So practical measures, and we're a part of that.
And on that modal shift and that integrated approach to some degree, I don't know if you're aware, but in Scotland, the Scottish Government has a target of reducing car kilometres by 20% by the end of the decade, and essentially every transport policy is viewed through that prism, be it buses, be it active travel, be it what have you, and you obviously be aware of the active travel spend in Scotland. Do you think that's an approach that could be considered by the government down here?
Well, Lee Craigie, the commissioner, or my equivalent in Scotland, she's just moved on, but we work closely together. I think a lot of the Scottish policy is very strong, and the integration is a huge part of it. We have that now, so a lot of the different funding for combined authorities and for buses, active travel, as we'll hear during these proceedings, is a part of that. And it's built into it, and I think that's a really progressive way to do it. And
if I can go on to you, Mr Williams, so senior appointments have now been made and the framework documents published. So what remains for Active Travel England to be formally constituted as an exec agency?
So we are formally constituted as an exec agency, but we're still recruiting some of our senior posts, but we have a majority of them in place now. And then there's a raft of other positions going live this week.
So if it
5 weeks we've existed.
5 weeks.
Yeah, policy was 2 years ago.
I'm usually 6 weeks behind the time, so that's not a surprise. So, Mr. Owens, what are your immediate priorities for establishing your functions and activity, other than filling those last vacant posts?
Yeah, people. So at the moment we're around about 20 people. We need to get ourselves up to around 98, which is our maximum capacity. So getting people to do more of the stuff is absolutely critical. But we're working really well with our colleagues in the DFT to do things where we don't yet have our own resource. So that's absolutely priority number one. Priority number two is ensuring that some of our funding just gets through the machine, which we can talk about in a minute, and then we're off.
Okay, and lastly, if we come back to yourself, Chris, in terms of budget, I don't want to go to belabour this point, but obviously in Scotland, by the end of this Parliament, there will roughly be about seven times per head. I mean, the cost of living crisis may change this, but there's an aim at the moment, certainly for the active travel budget, to be around 7 times per head higher in Scotland than it is down here. So are you happy with the budget that's been provided to active travel England?
Well, we have, as you know, a dedicated £2 billion fund, and we're actually overseeing, probably more poignantly, so built into some of those other funding mechanisms I mentioned, we're overseeing £3.8 billion. We know that if we're going to reach the targets, it will require £9 billion, stop me if I'm wrong, 9 billion, between 9 and 18 billion, depending on how it's done. So if we focus on areas of high population density, we focus on people who have the capability now to meet targets by 2030, we can do that. If we want to spread it more equitably across the country, going to rural areas, then that will move towards 18 billion. That's a governmental choice.
I think we need to prove as ATE that we're a safe pair of hands, and once we do that, I think it will be perfectly legitimate for us to start arguing for that number to increase.
Just as an organisation, I think you might have touched on this earlier, but just for the record, how many staff do you expect to employ?
98.
90, okay.
We're capped at that.
I think we'll come on to the budget in more detail a little later on, and rural areas, how we tackle that issue a little later on, but back to you, Ken.
Right, Gavin, we're really keen to know exactly how much you will actually need to deliver the targets that the government has actually set, but we'll save that. Well, one final question from me on this section, and actually comes to your CV, Danny. I know we sometimes see that diversity isn't there in terms of people with the corporate experience coming into government agencies. I mean, 25 years leading media businesses. What attracted you to this particular role?
It's a really good question. So, as you say, I spent my professional career working in media and tech businesses, essentially startups and building those up. During most of that time, I've been involved in some form or fashion in advocating for safer or better cycling and walking. It started when I lived in the City of London, and I was involved in helping work on contraflow cycling streets, which was quite important at the time, and essentially evolved as I saw more of my colleagues really starting to cycle to work, and some of my colleagues being knocked off on their cycle to work, essentially that my passion play has always been around this. So what appealed here was partly him phoning me up, but actually was really bringing the two together. I really like the excitement of building something new, which is what we're doing here, and I'm deeply committed to making this country a better and safer place to walk and cycle.
Right, lovely. Thank you very much. Right, let's go on to your strategic aims and functions. And to start us is going to be Graham Morris.
Thanks, Chair. Good morning to the witnesses. In Active Travel England's framework document, it actually says that one of your strategic aims is putting walking and cycling at the heart of transport, placemaking and health policy. So I know there are difficulties because you haven't got the requisite number of staff yet, but how do you plan to achieve that? Particularly interested in what you're going to do on health policy.
Well, I'll open. I mean, Danny will talk you through the nuts and bolts of it, but as alluded to earlier, a lot of the building blocks are already in place. So, crudely speaking, in Greater Manchester, if you want your money for buses, you've got to do the active travel part as well. So the policy is there for us to enact. Our job is to make sure it is of a standard that's usable, so we don't waste public money. So it's actually over the last 2 years, despite Active Travel England only existing for 5 weeks, the policy is really solid. And in this interim period, we've used a hybrid model of DFT existing staff to help start that delivery process, even though we don't exist. So it's been quite a frantic few months. In terms of the different areas, I don't know if you want to pick up.
Yeah, firstly, we've been involved with DFT and also colleagues in the Department for Health on social prescribing, which was something that was announced a couple of weeks ago, and we're looking to mesh those much closer together so that we collaborate particularly on data and evidence for what that's doing. And we'll be looking over the next few weeks as we start to recruit people into particularly our data side and our analysis side, to recruit people with particular specialisms who come from that sort of background. We're not purely about transport, we're about changing some of those things for the better where we can, albeit we're tiny, right? So there's only going to be 98 of us. What we can do is influence, have discussions and help to try and shape frameworks and policies with colleagues in other departments. And I very much see the way that AT is going to work as being, we can only succeed if other people help us to succeed. So it's going to be about collaborating, and that's been very much my track record, coming back to my sort of professional and personal interest, has been how do you get other people to help you make things happen? But there's no way we can do it on our own, and we don't want to be set up like that anyhow, because we're not really about forcing change from the top. We're about trying to bring other people on the journey and seeing if they can run with it.
Can I just add as well, I mean, it's worth saying, and I said it to the Health Task Force, this Active Travel England and the Gear Trains strategy is the biggest single health intervention this government is making. This is built into everybody's everyday life. So the benefits, although we're here to talk about transport, are much, much wider. And to that end, I won't go into detail at this time, if you don't mind, Chair. I'm putting together an ancillary advisory group to the board with notable names from different departments, including health, that will actually help us integrate policy across the board and make sure it is properly joined up. And that's probably the most effective thing, other than getting tarmac on the ground, that we will actually do, is to make sure it's visible and valued across the political spectrum.
It's interesting that when you said working with other departments and agencies, because there's a concern that by setting up a separate standalone agency, the department is kind of just saying, well, you crack on with this agenda. But you did mention that you were relying quite heavily, at least in the interim, on support from the department to deliver your agenda. You don't have that feeling that you're being pushed out along the plank.
Well, one of the reasons I was attracted to Danny is, if I can talk publicly about his character, steely but all about helping you get it right. But if you don't want to get it right, that's fine. We'll work with other people. So it's very, very much help. Already established excellent links throughout the Department for Transport, who are our parent body and essential for delivering. We must be involved with rail. We must be involved with Highways England. That has to happen, and we've identified and started those conversations. So no, we have a specialism, I think, is the key. Active Travel England has a collective knowledge, but for the first time ever for the Department for Transport, rather than giving out money with a criteria, we actually have the ability to help. And we've never done that before. And we've actually started with the first 200 million that was allocated a few months ago. Some authorities didn't have designs, and Danny's team was able to say, do you want some help? In a couple of cases, would you like us to draft something for you? And that's a wholly new, collaborative and helpful way to get the job done. Some of those authorities may say no, and that's fine, but the vast majority have been very positive.
I know we're going to come back to that a bit later, because there's huge disparities in different parts of the country, isn't there? I mean, I'm thinking about my area in particular compared to Manchester or London. But I just want to follow up on something that Danny said earlier, and again, going from the framework document, Active Travel England's charged with influencing the public debate. Now,
Charged with what, sorry?
Influencing the public
right,
debate, leading it. And I understand that point about having the evidence to persuade people, and you said some people don't want to participate. So how are you going to do that?
Well, maybe I'll clarify how I see the public debate piece, but before I do that, the first comment would be the DFT did a great job of essentially building up a shadow structure for us and assigned a certain number of roles that for me to kind of pick up on literally day one. I've slightly changed that straight off the bat so that we have more focus on data and analytics particularly, and that's my professional background, so I feel quite comfortable in that. But I think that's really important for helping have a common consensus around some of the data points, some of which get very muddied at a local level at the moment. So that's one point. The second point I'm now blanking on, but that we're coming to public debate. I don't think it's ATE's job to influence the public at large necessarily, and we're too small to do that. That doesn't feel appropriate. But what I do think it's appropriate to do is to help local councillors, local politicians, MPs understand what good could look like if they want to adopt that. It's not our role to impose it. It's our role to give facts and information and data, or media type stuff. So for example, right now we're putting together 15 guidance videos for local transport planners on literally case studies. How do you do this? How do you do that? We're doing exactly the same for local councillors on here are examples of things that have been done and what local councillors felt about them before, during, after that process. It's really about encouraging others to see what's possible.
So at the different strands, there's a different strategy for influencing individuals, a different set of tactics or strategies for businesses and for organisations, be they local authorities or others. We've got things like the Cycle to Work skid. Used to be in fact, I think it used to run in Parliament, where there was a scheme you could actually get a loan, and you could get a bike and bicycle into work if it was reasonable.
And that's actually a really good example, right? So that's still a DFT initiative, but colleagues at DFT are coming to us and talking to us about that. How can we change that, for example, for people who need who need accessibility type tools, who need perhaps mobility devices, things like that. And those sorts of discussions haven't really happened to the same extent that they're happening now, and that's quite exciting for everybody, because we can feel a potential to open that up and make more opportunities for people.
Okay, that's helpful.
If I could speak briefly to the communication point. Active Travel England is a delivery agency. It's not an advocacy agent, or rather it's not a campaigning agent. I think that's really important. So there's two elements of the communication that we do, I think, is making sure that messaging is correct. My job when speaking to the public via various mediums is to context this in what this actually means and to stop it being divisive. So it's not about cars and people riding bikes as separate species. It's about how would you like your kids to get to school? Would you like to not have to drive them to school? And because we can connect, if we choose and utilise the right language, with the values that the vast majority of people have. So that's my bit. Internally, I think, as Danny's just alluded to, is who are the decision makers? Who are the people who are understandably nervous? And we've both worked, myself in the Northwest, with councillors and understand their problems. To actually connect them with somebody like Clyde Lokes from Waltham Forest and various other examples to go, this is what it was like for the first year, it was really grim. This is what happened afterwards. And to see that's consistent, that actually people would be just as vociferous now if I tried to take it away. And local councils don't have access to that knowledge because everybody's buried working flat out in their own little world. And that's the part of communication to shift the debate that active travel can actually contribute to.
Thanks. Chair.
Thanks, Graham. Greg, over to you.
Thank you, Chairman. Good morning. Building on some of the themes from those last two questions, can I look at a specific policy that was mooted over the summer and then went on sort of the great hamster wheel of it's on, it's off, it's on, it's off, of this concept of registration?
Excuse me, Greg, I'm actually quite deaf.
Oh, sure.
So
Okay, let me speak up.
Yeah, sorry, we're struggling.
Thank you.
Here as
Sorry.
well, so I think we'll probably all have to speak up. Danny, I think your mic may have actually switched itself around, so that might help us too. Sorry.
Typically, the most modern part of Parliament is the part that works the least best in terms of work. So, building on the themes that came out of your answers to the last two questions, can we look at a very specific concept and so that the committee can best understand how Active Travel England plays into these things? We had the it's on, it's off concept of cycle registration over the summer. It was announced, then it was denied, then it was dismissed, and then some said it was a good idea. No matter what people's view on that policy was, can you take us through, were you consulted on that before it came out? Were you part of the mechanism that then essentially killed it? When we get into the specifics like this, where is your exact role in that? Who wants to go first? Chris or Danny?
May I? Well, our role in that, so no, we weren't consulted on that. And the DFT's data has looked at this several times, I think once in the last year, and showed that any measures like that would be very much not in the public interest. I think the only place that has registration is in the world is North Korea. So it would not be useful, it would not uptake, it would mean the bureaucracy around it would cost hugely to address a problem that isn't really there. I think I think what often people confuse is enforcement and legislation, very different things. So the ability to enforce is there now. And so I think it was almost useful for that to be aired and people to re-examine it. So Active Travel England wasn't part of that, and it's not Active Travel England's job to actually get involved in policy. That's the Secretary of State, that's ministers' job to decide what their position is. Ours is a delivery agency. I hope that we will be able to now start to inform that messaging much more clearly and align it with government policy. So I think there's a real opportunity for us there to help make sure that the messaging is right. And I think we might get into more of that a bit later on, but there's quite a bit of making sure how the message is delivered lines up with making sure the public sees the whole picture. Context is what's often missing in those sound bites, and context is absolutely everything. It can turn it around 180 degrees.
I accept that. Just before you come in, Danny, though, if we're looking, and you're absolutely right to say ministers decide, but if we are looking at all sorts of measures that will meet the objectives that you've been set, surely as a principle should it not be the case that where a concept, be it cycle registration or insurance, or forget the whys and wherefores of the exact policy, but policy that could change nationally, either in legislation or guidance or whatever it might be, coming from government, if you're to be the most effective, haven't you got to be more than just the delivery agency and actively feeding into that process?
Yeah, I'll try and talk more loudly. Hopefully that is better. So yeah, and we were talking just now about the Cycle to Work scheme, for example, where absolutely we'll be influencing and advising and trying to help steer on that. I think with this particular example, that kind of came out of the blue in a media statement, so that's possibly slightly different. But yeah, absolutely, we're about helping to influence frameworks. So if you look, for example, at planning, we're talking all the time with our colleagues now at DLUC, and looking at ways that we can help them as specialists in some of their thinking. If you look at, for example, EV charging and curbside points for EV chargers, we're talking to them, the people working on that, about what does that mean for access to pavements, right? And for wheelchair users, or for people who are pushing prams or other mobility devices. So as each of these steps up, we're getting involved. We've set up an internal board where we're essentially triaging all of those. At the moment, we're sharing some of that with our colleagues at DFT, and that will keep evolving. But that's an internal operational thing to keep us sort of live and aware of what's going on.
I think the very shortest answer is yes.
Yeah, basically.
But 5 weeks, and you have how many dedicated employees at the moment?
Slightly under 20.
So less than 20 people, so I completely agree.
Just picking up, thanks, Greg. Just picking up Greg's points there. on messaging. I mean, there seems to be this sort of perception, particularly certain quarters of the press, that cyclists are outside of the law and regulations that other motor users have to abide by, which is not the case. And so do you see yourself as actually sort of being sort of responsible for messaging, for making that clear? And actually, for those of us that cycle in London, it's incredibly frustrating because I was at a junction and there must have been about 30 of us waiting at a light, and someone just dawdled along and went straight through it. And as I said to that person, you give us all a bad name. But motorists get the exact same situation where the minority give a bad name, but cyclists seem to be tarred by the same brush. What are you going to do to kind of sort of, pull some of the bad cyclists up and at the same time defend the majority of good cyclists? Do you see that within your role as well? Because ultimately that encourages more people to cycle if they feel it's safe to cycle.
I think almost the short answer again is no. We're not an enforcement agency, and so people breaking the law, regardless of how they're travelling, should be prosecuted. Where you don't have the resource to prosecute everybody, then it would be logical to start with those that can do the most harm and work backwards. And that seems to be the most robust position that I can think of. People are often surprised when I say, well, yeah, absolutely, you should prosecute a cyclist that's breaking the law. Really? Of course you could. But then you context it. As I mean, context is everything. But if you can't do everything, where do you start? What can do the most harm? Whatever that might be, and work backwards. And I think that's about as equitable and fair as we can get. But it is an enforcement issue as opposed to a regulation issue. So all of the rules and regulations are in place to do that. So it's not actually, and I'm very much on the messaging front that we move away from a tribalisation of people travelling this way, do this, people drive it. It's people, and people will behave badly whether they're walking or driving a car or on a bicycle at roughly the same proportions. So we just have to focus first on those that can do the most harm to others.
Great. Okay, well, we'll move on. We're keen to look at the active travel targets you've talked about and the progress that's being made. I'm going to hand back to you, Greg.
Thank you, Chairman. I want to look at some of the forecasts, what lies underneath them, how reliable they actually are, because when you look at some of the stats that we've got from the National Travel Survey, etc., that talks about very small increments in percentages of people that have got on a bike or walked instead of driving or so on. For a start, the data from July seems to suggest the 2025 targets aren't going to be met, but how useful are these very specific targets in the first place, and how reliable is the monitoring of them? I know your background is very much in this data analysis. I mean, how does anyone know that I walked for 15 minutes this morning? It seems to be quite a difficult thing to get your head around. Danny, do you want to have a...
I think we're twin response.
I think there's... So if you're alluding to the figures that were released by DFT last week, the 8%, or 7% I think it was, wasn't it? Yeah. That was really unfortunate, I think, and this is the real opportunity for us as well, which Danny can speak to, that cycling had dropped by 7%. The unfortunate part of it was released on its own, because driving had dropped 23% and train use had dropped 47%. So releasing that figure on its own gave 180 degrees the wrong impression. In fact, active travel cycling in particular was the most robust in that period of all modes. So that should really give us some cause for hope. And I'm delighted that, Danny very much talked to the data. In fact, it was him that actually went and put that into the context again, and it's a word I'll keep using. The picture from that data was very strong. And it backs up what we saw in the pandemic, where when we were seriously under stress, the cycle use went up 300% in some places.
So the data point of 50%, or that target, is actually incredibly helpful because it focuses us as a team, and it focuses us in the way that we communicate with the outside world on this is our objective. Our absolute core objective is increasing the number of active travel trips. I think that's good. It's really healthy for an organisation to have one metric that actually matters, and this metric matters, and we can anchor everything else around it. So that in itself is a really useful starting point, I think, for any team or organisation to have, so we know where we're going, and then what we try and do is ensure that what we're delivering delivers against that core objective. So that I think is helpful. The survey that you referred to, and as Chris said, at the moment we're slightly catching issues like that as they come up. What I hope and expect we'll move to is being more involved in shaping the way that is done in the future. I have some concerns would be too strong a word, but
you've said it now.
Yeah, about the way that is put together and how it's what it actually represents. But there are other sorts of measures and other data points which haven't really been given enough time to bed down in kind of active travel world. So the way we calculate value for money is it uses very, very minimal data points that aren't fully accurate. So there's a whole program we need to build around really representing this stuff properly and better, using tools and data that are now available that weren't available previously. So, for example, Google Maps and movement data. There's some of that's beginning within DFT. We can accelerate that, and that's super exciting. So the team we're looking to build on the data side will be able to do that kind of big computing and big representation of analytics. But we're trying to do it in a way that would help, for example, a local constituency MP see how that impacts their own area or their own high street, rather than at just a macro level.
That's a very helpful answer, and it goes to, I guess, my follow-up, which is how useful setting a numbered... everyone has to have a metric, I accept that. But how useful is it setting a very specific, we want to see an X% increase in cycling and X% increase in walking, as opposed to coming it from the other way round and actually looking at more the metrics being, well, what have we actually done to help people do X, Y, and Z? Because at the end of the day, it's going to come down to personal choice. I have no doubt that lots of people actually have been spurred into it because of all the various watches and things that, you know, they like to see how many steps they've done that day or whatever in a way that you couldn't do 10 years ago. Isn't the better metric actions taken rather than a pretty meaningless number of increasing
so I agree
journeys?
with you. I agree with you. However, in startup phase, which is where we are right now, it's useful when you've got a very small team and you're really just beginning. As Chris said, I'm 5 weeks in, just have one, right? But it will absolutely be my job to make sure that we're delivering against what you're talking about, and that's much more meaningful, right? You want to be able to talk to a local councillor or a local MP and say, look, based on evidence that we've got from elsewhere, we've run the numbers properly. You might expect X to happen in your local environment or your local area. That's what I aspire to us being able to do, but that's probably 18 months, 2 years away before we really have that anchored down.
If I could build on that, on a micro level, going back to my regional work, one of the schemes that we banged on about to the point I just got sick of it was the Oxford Road cycling corridor, which incidentally was built with bus money, not active travel money, 6 kilometres, and when it went in it saw a 200% increase in cycling in a single year. So on that micro level, that was politically very, very helpful for somebody who's trying to do hard stuff to show that difference. So I think both having a national target is really important because it keeps everybody honest. I think my background is from measuring everything from quite a long time ago, and it allowed you to see whether you were closer, further away, but that doesn't mean we can't break that down. So we were able, for example, with the £200 million allocation earlier this year, we could say how many kilometres of safe space that would deliver, how many new active travel journeys that would allow, and that's the bit that's useful. I
think you're hitting on actually.
That is exactly what I'm hitting on.
It's the difference almost between DFT and ATE. At DFT level, it's fine to have a slightly broad brush approach of which we've just been talking about. At ATE level, that's not really acceptable. We need to we need to justify ourselves, and we need to justify ourselves to local decision makers, not just at a national level.
But so my final question, really briefly, to link that together and to put it to you where I'm coming from with this. So I think of my own constituency, we've got some very safe, in 335 square miles of rural North Buckinghamshire, we have one greenway at the moment, the Wadston Greenway, which links Aylesbury Vale Parkway to Wadston. Our main levelling up bid that is in the current process is to build a safe cycle space that links that Wadston Greenway all the way up to Silverstone Race Track through Buckingham, Stowe, etc. Are you not better having a target that, Chris, to your point, looks at kilometres built that will enable, as opposed to the actual journeys taken on it? Because I've got a belief, particularly from the rural nature of my constituency, the vast majority of constituents I speak to don't really want to get on a bike on the rural roads with absolutely. The HGVs thundering past, the tractors and big agricultural machinery before you even get onto cars. Yeah. That's why there has to be separate safe space built. Is that not the better metric to look at?
Internally, we've internally built that metric already. So we set ourselves by 2025 to be funding 3,000 miles, we can do it in kilometres, of active travel routes. That's one of the metrics. We want to interact with 2,000 projects. We want to be involved with at least 1,000 new housing developments and helping make those all work better. Those at the moment are internal metrics, but the wider sort of metrics around more people travelling, etc., we have to build, because that hasn't been given quite the focus that it now needs in the past. Does that make?
Yes, but that's very clear. Thank you, Chairman.
Thanks, Rick. So just wrapping up on this, we see the National Travel Survey, which is published certainly it's been published just recently for the last year. That goes through every single mode of transport and the metrics for usage, whereas it appears that because of the July's Cycling and Walking Investment Strategy report to Parliament, that was just focused purely on the cycling and walking metrics and it completely taken out of kilter. Would it be better for the department just to refer to one bank of metrics which are actually time period identical to each other? Otherwise, the metrics that apply to you just don't have any context, do they? Is that something that you think we should be pushing as an idea to the department?
Yes, although we are also working on that from the bottom up, if that makes sense.
Yes, well, we're all aligned on that basis.
So
good. Okay, well, let's move on rapidly. Managing the active travel budget, and I'm handing back again to Greg Smith.
Okay. Seems like we're yo-yoing. I promise you this is the last one from me. Can you just, first up, very straightforward, what's the total amount of funding that you're going to manage through to 2025?
So we're directly managing just over 700 million, but we're overseeing 2 billion's worth of other funding where we're having an influencing voice rather than directly overseeing it.
Can you just break, I mean, I mentioned in my last question, my council with my support is putting in a levelling up bid for cycle infrastructure. Is that the sort of thing you're including in the over the 700 million oversight? Can you break it down?
Breaks down, and so the levelling up and other things, we don't directly control that funding. Obviously, that comes from other sources. But what we do is, for example, on the levelling up funds, we're now reviewing all of those submissions. So your area's submission will be something that we're now looking at, and what we're doing in those is helping advise DLUC on whether or not the bid needs improving, and then coming in and actually making suggestions about how we could make that work better for everybody. Of the 700 million, we directly control that funding, and we can directly issue that funding to highways authorities. So there's a kind of split between areas where we indirectly influence it and directly control it.
So that leads to one of the more widely spoken about criticisms, not of you, but of the system as it stands. The funding packages for this policy area are piecemeal, inconsistent, separated out, very siloed. Do you think your creation as an organisation can bring all of that together, or is it still going to be a little bit... Well, and what will it take to bring it together? You referenced a few times you're only 5 weeks into the job, so I don't expect you to have all the answers, but how do we get over this, why things are quite legitimate historic criticism that there's just different pots of money everywhere and no real oversight?
I'm very new to the civil service, so my answer is in context, right? Firstly, I think that I mentioned earlier we need to prove we're a safe pair of hands to be trusted with how we spend money, and I'm confident we'll be fine with that. I don't think it's a problem that there's different funding sources. That's okay. What matters is that we can influence and help shape those for the better where possible. That said, seeing consistent funding is really important. I mean, I've talked to local authority, highways authorities, where they have 40% of their transport team complete, and they can never recruit 100% because the funding is has been traditionally so inconsistent in this country, unlike other countries, that people aren't going to commit their jobs or their livelihoods or their homes to that kind of career, right? So that is definitely something that needs fixing if we're going to take this seriously. And right now, as an example, we're in a slightly odd situation where, although we are set up to deliver that 700 million of funding, the latest round of infrastructure funding has actually ended, and we're sort of in a limbo period as we change ministers. So there's currently no infrastructure funding going ahead for England yet. But it is going ahead for London because that's already been signed off. So it's still a bit clunky. I'm sure we'll be fine, and we've just got to get over a few sort of internal...
the first thing we do is build trust, build relationships. So I mentioned the health benefits and the fact that this is the single biggest health intervention the government's making. But that voice wasn't previously at the table, so that was at the Health Task Force. And a lot of people around the table who were so busy dealing with symptoms sat back and went, oh yeah. And that voice wasn't there. And that's the point of Active Travel England, to coordinate. There will always be different funding streams. I think that's not going away. But now we have the capacity to have somebody who will plug into all of that, bring it together, coordinate it, bring somebody from rail, somebody from Highways England, all to the same table to have an agreed plan. And I think, as Danny mentioned, with London now has secured its deal, I think it's for a couple of years, £80 million a year, which Active Travel England will help ensure that the standards are in line with the rest of the country. Treasury now has a 3-year business plan in front of them for Active Travelling to deliver this as part of the funds that Danny mentioned. So we're really quite excited about that getting signed off until we can give local authorities that continuity to plan and employ.
Thank you very much.
So just for hand over to Ruth Cadbury. So using London TfL as an example, is your involvement within London as a result of the department's request that we have a sort of standardised process, because thing, notwithstanding the devolved aspects of it, or is it actually a collaboration you already have with the Mayor of London and TfL?
There was very much a desire to ensure that London standards were exactly the same as the rest of the country. It's a different funding model, that's absolutely fine. Relationships that Danny and the team have built with London, with Will Norman, with TfL are already great. You know, we all want the same thing, and it's absolutely fine. I've visited a couple of councils in London to go and have conversations. That's been fed back to TfL. And a part of our job, we can't enforce, and nor should we, but we then go back to the funding partner. So it might be TfL, it might be another department who's responsible for crust funding, can't remember what it is, and say this scheme is not up to standard. You know, we can't recommend that be funded. But then that's for the other body to actually implement that policy. And it might be that the recommendation from the Secretary of State was then funding will be withheld on that. So that's how we're going to integrate all of this stuff together. And early days, absolutely, but relationships are already building fast and been wholly positive.
Yeah. Okay. Ruth Cadbury, over to you.
About the total amount of funding available for active travel. And for instance, the government's target on cycling is 1.6 billion cycle stages by 2025, and there seems to be a common consensus in the active travel world that the funding available is out and by a long way, and should be in the range of £6 to £8 billion over that period. So what's your assessment of the adequacy of the funds that are available for active travel?
Can I put that question in the context of who we're working with, so the delivery partners we're working with? We've just completed an assessment process where we've gone out to all of the highways authorities around the country, and we've said to them, we'd like you to tell us how you see yourselves in terms of your ability to deliver, in terms of your local leadership and support for active travel, and also in terms of how prepared you are in terms of your planning and how much your active travel policies are integrated with health, with other things. They've come back to us, I have to say actually amazingly, when I first met everybody, I think it was on the 1st or 2nd of August, and I said, you've got 3 weeks to do this. And there's an audible and collective sigh of, you must be joking, it's August, go away. By the end of the meeting, it turned into, yeah, absolutely, we're up for this. 69 out of 70 highways authorities in the local authorities returned their submissions on time. All the MTAs returned their submissions on time. Absolutely fantastic work and super buoying. The reason I'm going on that story is that I think my response is contextual, right? So what we're finding is that some authorities aren't yet at a place where they can meaningfully deliver sort of some of the bigger schemes or bigger or more complex projects, or politically they're not quite there yet. So what we have to do is find ways to match funding with both local leadership and support, and also local technical capability to deliver. So yeah, absolutely would like to be working with a larger funding pot, but I think as a country, the whole country's on a bit of a journey here, and we have to find a way to kind of mesh with that and get into the right, pardon the pun, gear with different partners, and then start to bring everybody up who wants to be brought up.
Okay, can I just add one point, if that's okay? And you've heard me make it before. The amount of money is important. We know what it costs to deliver. It's going to be between 9 and 18 billion, dependent how ministers want it delivered. If we focus in, then we can do it for 9. If we don't focus in, then it's going to cost 18.
Is that by 2030?
That's by 2030, yeah. What is more important than that is consistency. That's what local authorities need, is consistency, to know that they can employ people and they can start to build that capability. And I think that's more key than... Both are important, but consistency is the one that local authorities know, so they can plan ahead, because this is a change to what we do to our streets. And so some are already on their way and have officers in place who can do the designs. Others can't afford it, and it's how do you get them started. So I think that's a point that's important.
Okay, so so you've basically identified a risk that we have, that there's a gap, there's an inconsistency in terms of levels of leadership and technical capability, but you're kind of what you're saying is you're focusing on those that are able and ready to deliver, and hope.
And those where they're not yet ready, we apply different measures. So, for example, if you're not quite there, our focus there, in your case, will be building your technical capability so that you can actually work with us rather than we just give you money that goes in the wrong direction. Okay,
and then a lot of England is still in the two-tier county district system. How can you support district councils that are up for active travel and have the political leadership and the technical capacity, but are not supported by their county authority?
That's a fantastic question, because it's absolutely our key weak point at the moment. Is again, due to the size of who we are, we had to take the decision that we'd operate at highway authority level. Over the next 12 months, maximum 18, we want to evolve that into being able to work and collaborate with district or local councils, and the same would operate, for example, within an MTA that we're operating at the moment. With the MTA as our delivery partner, and that's correct, but there may be, and we're leaving the MTA to decide for itself who it wants to work with within its operating area.
Okay, thank you. So, how you're delivering, all local authorities have to follow the design guidance which are for cycling set out in the local transport note 1/20 and for walking the manual for streets. And that's how they get your funding. So do you anticipate the conditions are going to provide clarity on design expectations, and will they help to resolve disputes between local authorities and, say, the DFT over scheme designs? Are they a help?
I didn't fully understand the question. Actually.
Well, no. I suppose how strong are you going to use conditionality?
So the guidance is super helpful.
It is?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. That's the answer.
I'll just add, it's not perfect, and so we have to be mindful that in some situations we all need to flex, and we'll need to learn from it. So we'll be inviting quite soon local authorities to help participate in shaping some of that guidance. Yeah. Again, that's, I think, slightly different to how the DFT might have operated in the past. We're not coming as a top-down, we're coming as a top-down, but now let's help sort it out together.
And just talking to the Chair's point earlier about enforcement, I think that's where it's firm but fair and collaborative. So this is the process, because we've brought in a lot of expertise, and a lot of that expertise has come from local authorities. Here's how we're going to assess, but then tell us how we can do it better. Make sure that it's an evolving tool, but ultimately, if the will is not there, the leadership is not there to deliver. If you've only employed one officer and you'd really like to build a £20 million scheme, we're all going to fail if we let that happen, and so we won't. So we will help an authority who really wants a £20 million scheme. Well, this is what you need to put in place, or we will match. In the first instance, we will match resources that are offered to the capability and the political support in the area, and I think that's. It's robust, and I've seen it work on a regional level. Okay.
So for some schemes, in order to receive funding, in effect, local authorities are going to have to reallocate some road space from vehicles to active travel, either widening pavements or creating segregated cycle paths, or both, and changing junction arrangements. Do you believe that local authorities are willing to take that step?
Some are, yes. But by no means the majority. Not yet.
And we need to create examples. So we know that in the last 10 years there's 28 billion more miles now being driven on minor roads around our homes, which is a staggering figure. I think it's I might need to correct it, but it's just under 30%. I think the increase is absolutely huge. So we have taken away, we filled up the space for alternatives, and to take that back is not pain-free. And I think in pockets there are absolutely authorities that say, well, we need to do this because we can't afford not to, and they will create examples and we will help grow those examples. So it isn't going to be uniform. In some cases it'll be absolutely no. If it touches traffic flow, we're not going there. In other places it will be yes.
Does some of the local pushback? It always seems to complain about space being taken for cycle paths, not a lot for widening pavements. We never hear pushback about bus lanes, do we?
Yeah, we do.
Yeah. To the same extent?
But I think, I actually worked in the Northwest when the BSIP funding was going through. And first of all, it stated you must do active travel at the same time. This is how people are going to get to the bus. So it's really important. And you can't have one without the other. And you can't just buy lots of buses. You have to make the space, because otherwise you'll have lots of shiny buses sitting in a traffic jam. So the road space allocation was more important than the actual making sure you've got the buses, so it's reliable and dependable and trustworthy. So it faces the same thing. We have a choice on how we use our collective road space, and it's becoming more apparent what our choices have done in the past and what needs to change.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Ruth. I'll bring in Robert Largan.
Thank you, Chair, and apologies for being late. Just following on from what's just been talked about, you've already really covered in your remarks already about the level of delivery expertise at local authority level and the varying different there are some that are excellent and some that need bringing up. But perhaps you could go into a bit more detail about how ATE plans to help build the capacity in those local authorities that aren't quite there yet. What sort of support is being provided? What is the training going to be like? It'd be useful if you could provide a bit more detail on that.
So firstly, the first step is funding. So providing funding for local authorities to train up their officials to essentially get their planning skills or their delivery skills up to scratch. So that's a set of funding letters that went out actually this week, and we're waiting for authorities to come back to us on that. But secondly, what we're already doing actually is looking at individual schemes. So if it's a cycling or walking scheme, we're looking at it, we're assessing it, and then we're providing written feedback with suggestions of how to improve it. So we're becoming almost like a centre of excellence that can provide help to them. So that's one point.
Is there a cost to local authorities for you doing that?
Not currently.
Not currently.
Not currently. That's where my corporate stroke public hats come into slight conflict, but so that's one angle. But if you look at planning, actually, there's two areas. One is if we think about planning rather than actual cycle walking schemes. What we're also looking to do is A, influence policy frameworks, but B, we're trying to find ways to help local authorities know what good looks like. So if you look at the planning environment, I think the Royal Town Planning Institute put out a report this week saying that investment in planning among in public bodies in the UK is 43 or 45% lower than it needs to be currently, and that was a statement that was fairly echoed by the DLUC Select Committee. Our job there, I think, is to provide toolkits and ways to help local authorities know what good looks like. So we're issuing, actually in the next couple of weeks, we're issuing our first planning toolkit. We're sharing that with I can't remember exactly how many, but it's a couple of dozen local authorities. They're going to be road testing it on live plans, coming back to us with feedback, and the idea is that we iterate and keep improving it on their behalf. So that will allow them to create essentially templated reports on to collaborate with developers better on areas where they can both sort of move the needle a bit better. So I think our role here is as an enabler of local authorities.
Okay. And what does good look like? What would be an example that we should be looking at? So what should I be telling my county council to go and look at?
Go for it. But if we were talking about, let's say, a new housing development, often you'll find that a new housing development will have car transport baked in as pretty much the only meaningful way for people to get about.
Yeah.
That's not great ultimately, and we want to find ways to enable different options and different opportunities. And the toolkits that we're working on are essentially giving clear guidance on how to make that happen.
Okay.
I think that that's a really good question at the end, or one certainly that resonates with me. The thing that changes people's opinion is looking, feeling, smelling, touching it yourself, and so you get it and you can see how it embeds. And those examples are in the UK; they are around. There's not a huge amount. We know of I can't remember. There's a school in Ipswich which has 60% of kids ride to school every day, which I've just been finding out about. And that is there, and it's because there's a network all around it, and that's remarkable. That is, that's more than Dutch levels of cycling. So imagine if we take people there. Waltham Forest, getting a bit sick of talking about Waltham Forest, and it's another London example. But London has had sustained funding for a period of time. It's been able to go through the journey and out the other side. But to take councillors there and speak to a councillor who was surrounded by huge protests at the time, who was actually not pro-cycling and walking at the start, and then came out the other side evangelical about it and being able to show all the benefits, I think that could be a benefit. Not lobbying, but an education part of Active Travel England's job, and one I'd be really keen to do. The piece that I missed in Greater Manchester is we provided that experience, and the people who turned up were all the ones who went, "This is going to be great, I love this stuff," as opposed to the ones, "I hate this stuff," and needed to know about it. And that's something I've got to find a way through. But I think that hearts and minds we have the evidence, we have the examples. I think a part of our job can be to join that up.
Interesting. Just sort of pivoting back a bit to that trying to improve those local authorities perhaps don't have the design capability.
Yeah.
Has ATE have any sort of thoughts of engaging with groups which perhaps aren't at the local authority level? I mean, for an excellent example would be in High Peak, where we have Buxton Town Team, which is a group of volunteers who've come together and written their own sustainable and active travel plan for the town, which is absolutely fantastic.
Yeah.
And it'd be really interesting if there's plans to engage with groups on that kind of level, perhaps where local authorities aren't doing what needs to be done.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So we've broken down, of the 98 people that we're going to be recruiting, we've broken down exactly how we think we're going to deploy them, and 56% of our resource will be deployed on reviewing, supporting, providing advice on specific plans or projects. 33% of our time will be spent on training or engagement. And that will be with either local authorities, it might be with developers, and it might be with local advocates or other teams of people who are trying to get change.
I think we don't have the capacity for that now, and I'm mindful that we need to be careful that we are a delivery agency. But there's lots of people who want to help and want to know how. Some guidance for them, and I think communicating with large parts of the public is something we could do, but we're going to have to feel our way with that.
Understood. Great. Well, thank you very much.
Can I have one more?
Of course you can.
What I've found incredibly interesting over the last 5 weeks or so is the amount of latent support that's bubbling away under the surface for what we're trying to do. And wherever I talk to people, there's a sense of, 5% of my brain thinks about this, or 3%, I'd really like it to be someone to help make it bigger, make the sum of the parts bigger. And I'm finding that everywhere, which is quite exciting, slightly terrifying, but quite exciting.
Fantastic. Chair, back to you.
Thanks, Robert. Just the final one to wrap up the funding section. I mean, we talk about the fact that there's 2 billion which is allocated up to 2025. Yeah. The targets are there to be delivered by 2030. You've said yourself it could take somewhere between 9 and 18 billion to meet those targets. But 2025 is not that far away in terms of future funding. Do you think there's something to be said for having a percentage of the department's budget allocated so that you've always got running funding? I mean, you work in the business background, Danny, you wouldn't expect your business just to run out of money and not do anything about it in 3 years ahead.
I think as that's more of a political decision, probably better I answer that. I think it is. It would be something I would certainly welcome. I'm sure Danny would welcome it as well. But it's not within our gift to do that. I think what we have is, what have we got to work with? 98 people, this much money. In actual fact, it's 3.8 billion, the amount that we are influencing to do with active travel specifically. And we have a time frame, and we have a target of 50%. So we've devised a strategy to actually meet that as best we can. But also make sure that ministers are appraised of, if to achieve this mission in total by the time we get to 20, it will take 9 billion if we do it this way. It will take 18 billion if we do it that way. And that is a political decision.
I understand it's a political decision, but I suppose also, if you've got targets which are to be delivered by 2030, then in an ordinary business form, you would expect the funding to actually take you to the same time as the targets as to be delivered, which will be 2030.
I would hope so, but again, that's not.
I know it's quite difficult. I thought I'd ask the question rather than actually put my opinion in.
This is what it takes to deliver the product.
Yeah,
and then it's a political decision of how important you think it is. I mean, I think it's fundamental, and I mentioned at the start, I consider it an obligation to provide cheap travel. I think it is incumbent on us to make sure that our kids can get to school under their own steam, and parents feel confident enough to let them. I think they should have the right to travel the streets and feel safe, and we can deliver that. And if this government prioritises that, funds it accordingly, then we'll get it done.
Which neatly takes us to our next section as to how we can widen participation in active travel. Graham Morris, to start.
Thanks very much, Chair. And we touched on it very briefly at the beginning about how active travel varies very much in different parts of the country, but even within a particular area, I mean, I've noticed in different parts of London as well, it's much more common and much more prevalent. I'm thinking about what can you do, or what can we do collectively, because you're not an advocate, you're not an advocacy agency, you've told us that, to encourage greater participation from women, from people with disabilities, and from people from ethnic communities.
I'll start, if that's okay. I mean, the key difference, and I'm quite pedantic about this, we need to use the word enable over encourage, because if you can encourage or provide bikes or do things that don't change the environment, then they will have very low impact until you make me feel safe, until you give me space, and it's connected to everywhere I want to go. And that's why LTM 120 is so important. And the work of Active Travel England, we will not fund something or back anything that doesn't do all of the journey where people want to go. So that's why it's so important. And so we can't skip around that. Safe space is the fundamental canvas, and without that we can't, I'm getting a bit lyrical now, well, we can't paint anything, we can't do anything. It's refreshing and scary to just cut to the chase and say, if I'm not feeling safe, I'm very unlikely to do it. And where that has been provided with travel is, active travel is very equitable. The numbers, I think in Holland, it's 51% of people who travel by bike every day are women. And it's financially equitable. It's a cheap form of travel. So it is there, but we have to focus in on what's really going to make the difference in a safe space. Once you have safe space, if a council or local authority has the courage to do that, that's where we should focus the activation work, because that's where we'll get best return for public money. So it does come down to political will and regional leadership to actually want to do it, and it's uncomfortable changing the use of street space, but if somebody wants to do it, then we can help them.
If I can back up that point, I think that there's 2 points to make. If you referenced different areas of the same city. If you look at London, I think if you travel around in, for example, northeast London, you'll see very different sorts of people on bikes to the sorts of people you see coming in from southwest London. And I think a large part of that is down to the conditions that they have to deal with. In northeast London, slower streets, a little bit more space for walking and cycling, long-term kind of plans to make that happen. Southwest, it's more of a race through on very busy arterials in kind of speedy bikes. So that's one thing. But one point that's worth picking up is also how ATE looks and feels. So kind of aware we're two white men. ATE needs to look and feel like the country it represents, and it needs to think about that. Who we recruit. So we are going to be proactively recruiting in different pools where we can, bearing in mind we have to blind recruit as a civil service department. So we'll go looking and fishing for people in different parts. We're putting accessibility and disability at the heart of how we think about things, and although I can't talk further about that will be an operational structure that we put in place. It's really important to me. The first public comment I made when I took up the post was talking about feminism in transport planning, and how typically planning is done for people who are making journeys from A to B, which might be home to work. Quite often that's men, and it's not as much about sort of multi-trip trips. So where you, I don't know, going from home to school to work. So I recently went with Minister Harrison to the Netherlands, and it was absolutely fascinating seeing Dutch stations which are absolutely rammed with bikes with kids' racks on the back, where mums would cycle their kids off to school, then pop to, or dads of course, and then pop to the station and go off to work. And that sort of multi-purpose trip is what we need to start thinking about.
Because conceivably, not that I'm suggesting that Active Travel England would do this, but if it was target driven and the aim is to increase the number of miles by concentrating on those who are already doing it at the margins, without broadening participation, without doing the delivery agency job of enabling safe spaces and so on, I suppose it could be done in a way that's not so inclusive I'm not suggesting you should or would. But, unless you set out deliberately to tackle issues that are stopping women or people from ethnic communities and so on.
The two things often go together. It's the areas that, most deprived areas are least likely to own a car.
Yeah.
I think it's about 30% of the country doesn't have access to a car. And that's where we need to do the most active travel, so the two things, I think, go together quite nicely.
Is that a general offer that you made to my colleague there about working with local authorities to provide, so that they can enable safe spaces to be created?
Well, I would just turn that challenge right around and say, if you've got the will to do it, if you will build to this standard, and the standard, what that means is it is usable by, well, I think the standard that we used in Greater Manchester, usable by a competent 12-year-old, and their parents would let them, and they would choose to. So if you build to that standard, you want to do it, and you have the political will and you have the capacity, then crack on. If you have some of those ingredients but not the others, we will help you. But the first one is the leadership locally to want to do it and see it through. And if that's not there, then everything else gets really, almost impossible.
We've been super clear in our communications, both written, and we've been holding regular drop-in sessions and Q&A sessions with local authorities every week since I started on that exact point. It's like the will to get there is absolutely critical.
Can I mention?
We're here to help people win bids.
Great. So I'm just going to tweet that out. Can I mention pavement parking? We've discussed it many times in this committee, and I know we've got a new Secretary of State. And there's a transport bill promised from the Queen's speech. What's your view on street parking? On pavement parking, and the impact that has on active travel on both walking and cycling?
I've actually got a picture of a tank parked in Greater Manchester on one of the streets. It's actually a people carrier, but I'd like to call it a tank because it's more dramatic. And it's the officer in charge in Greater Manchester said, "Do you want me to try and get it moved?" And I said, "No, I want you to go and use the normal process you would do and see what happens." And they couldn't get it moved. And everybody would get outraged. I was outraged when I showed them a picture of a tank on the pavement. And then I pointed the cars right behind the tank, taking up virtually the same amount of space. So that messaging around this is really important. It's a big cultural change. It has to be addressed. There has to, a parent pushing a double buggy was our minimum standard in Greater Manchester. I think it was minimum 1.5 metres. Or we wouldn't fund it. Walking is more important than cycling. It will need to do all of the heavy lifting. It is critical, and clear pavement is a huge part of that, and not just enough. We actually need enough that it's a pleasant experience, and one that I would choose, which is side by side having a conversation and dealing with the junction. So you know that we've done some work on exploring side road zebra crossings on the Desire Line as used in the rest of Europe and most supermarket car parks in the UK. That work is progressing really well now. That will be a cheap, simple way to reinforce the highway code and to service people who want to walk. So I've just rambled on quite a lot there, but I think cars belong on the road and people on the pavements.
It's already banned in London, isn't it?
It is.
Pavement parking. I don't suppose you've got a crystal ball, but is there any indication that a similar restriction is going to apply in the rest of the country? Is that provision going to be in the transport bill? Has anyone given you a nod and a wink?
That's not something I could discuss.
Okay.
But if anybody should bring in such legislation, they very much have my support.
Right, thank you.
We're actually given assurances it would be in the transport bill. And we have been given repeated assurances. I've been on this committee for 7 years that this would be brought in. We've done an inquiry, published recommendations that it could be. We see that it works well in London. It's not as if this is a scheme only operating in Mars. And yet we get countless promises and continued failure to deliver. So I personally very much hope
we're fairly actively engaging with people on that pretty much every day at the moment.
Yeah, anyone that doubts it should just go out with somebody that's lost their sight and see what they have to deal with all the time. Sorry, I rant on. Gavin, did you want to comment on this exact point?
I've got one
Before I go to Rob.
Yeah, thanks so much, Chair. And when I was asking questions earlier on, we mentioned about the wider transport policy, and you mentioned a more integrated approach down here now. But just to push on that, obviously I mentioned earlier on that there's an aim in Scotland to reduce car kilometres, as we're calling it, by 20% by the end of the decade, which informs or essentially informs everything else. So, for instance, in buses, you've got free bus travel for over 60s and under 22s. There's a lot more modern zero-emission buses, more modern rail, because we're decarbonising rail by 2035, frozen rail fares, etc. etc. As a minister driving active travel targets, how important is it that, and not only 10% of the travel budget will also be, or transport budget I should say, will also be spent on active travel by the end of this Parliament? How important is it to have that strategy and that single focus to drive this forward, if you're to meet those targets?
Well, I mean, almost on it, again, coming back to macro and micro, the progress we've made in the last 2 or 3 years has been because the Prime Minister has believed in this mission and pushed that policy. And we have now a properly integrated transport policy for active travel, and it is in the bus strategy, it is in the road. And I think that just shows how important political leadership, if that's what you are alluding to. And anything to do with change. I mean, we're talking culture change on how we use our streets, and culture change is always slow and it's always painful, and so you won't get there without that leadership. So it's important, if that's answering the question.
Yeah, some of it is about, you mentioned earlier, hit folk with a big carrot. Sadly, often I think this government tends to show a small carrot and hit folk with a big stick, so I think it's about getting that balance.
I'll let Danny get a word in a second, but I think our job is to create the properly evidenced options, so the first thing I did in Greater Manchester is we totted up what it costs to do what you do now. It's 3.75 billion. That's a fact. Here's how it breaks down. Can you afford that? So this is a case, if you want more people to ride and walk, this is what it will cost, and so you choose what you want us to do. And I think, and then on a local level, this is what it will take for people to ride and walk more, significantly more, and we will fund that. But if you don't want to do that, that's absolutely fine, but we're not funding it. And I think that trust, I'm not sure whether that's hard or just clear. I think Active Travel England will be a trusted partner, that you know what you get, and any answer that you give them will be properly evidenced, and if you can find a flaw in it, we'll change our position. And I think that's the biggest thing, and it's come all the way through this conversation, that Active Travel England is doing it, is it now a voice in the transport conversation at the top table, and able to make the case and context the evidence and plug it into health and plug it into do look, and that in a matter of weeks, months, has already started to change things. And I think Scotland have done an awful lot of that integration work already. I'll be living in Scotland shortly. I've just bought a house there. So.
Excellent.
Very interesting what happens across the border.
If we just cast our eyes a couple of 100 miles east, right, to the Netherlands, you've got an environment.
They're a bit better than Scotland at the moment. I'll give it that.
I'm quite a fan of Scotland. But if you look at the Netherlands, they per capita car ownership about the same, slightly higher than here. They love their cars. It's actually a brilliant place to drive. However, 51% of people arriving at train stations in the Netherlands arrive by bike, and the reason they do that partly is infrastructure. It's also masses of parking, the fact that you can pick up a Dutch railway bike at either end. We have to be integrated with transport. In Northumberland, where our new Secretary of State comes from, there's potentially a new railway line coming. Like, activating that railway line with walking and cycling so that it links properly, absolutely critical. So the closer we can be aligned to public transport at a ministerial level, the better.
Okay, thanks, Jeff.
Robert.
In terms of local buy-in and adaptation for new schemes such as widening pavements for segregated cycle paths, the work the government implemented during COVID using pop-up infrastructure was very successful. Is there still a role for pop-up infrastructure and temporary regs changes as a way of rolling out or trying out schemes?
So we're not funding it in our current thinking, but it was useful for local authorities to be able to test stuff that they'd had on their books for ages. In some cases it may have been a little hasty, in others it was more successful. But for the next phase of our funding, we're not planning to do that.
I think I was on when the pop-up stuff went in. I was in the northwest. What they're not pop-up now. They would be trials, and I'm a big supporter of trials because it gives people a chance to try different. It's not always applicable. It's very hard to trial a junction. You know, you've got to commit really beforehand, and it's junctions that are key. Junctions are more important than the links. They're the bits where it's really difficult and often get left, and so the other bit doesn't get used at all. But trials, I am a big fan. It allows people to try different. It takes away a lot of the fear, and so it might be something that we explore, but it's technically quite difficult when the bits that make a difference are very difficult to trial without jumping in. And hopefully those trials can then be used elsewhere, not just it's over in Greater Manchester now and several other parts. There's Cyclops junctions going in en masse that enable kids to ride to a local school, even turning right across traffic without ever coming into contact with traffic, and the traffic flow is actually improved. So those examples, those trials can then be used elsewhere, and I think that's probably going to be more useful for us in the long run.
Robert.
Thanks, Chair. Mr. Woolidge talks about very compellingly a lot of the reasons why the Netherlands very good active travel, very good statistics. Yeah. So there's they played a very key role, but of course there is another element to that, which was the geography. So the Netherlands is significantly flatter and is also comparatively more urban. Speaking as someone who represents the Peak District, obviously a lot of the targets are very much focused around urban areas. So I'm compelled to ask, what are the plans to try and improve active travel in those rural areas where it is a much more challenging landscape? In more ways than one.
By all of those points, they're completely right. So by the nature of our core objective, we do have to focus a little bit more on places where there are more people per square mile. But there's absolutely funding in there for rural communities, and I very much hope that we see really good bids from rural communities. We've run the numbers and actually slightly increased the amount of funding we expect to be putting into rural communities when we do our next funding round. There's loads of ways we can work. If we just step away from cycling for a minute and we think about, let's take the schools in rural communities, right? Villages that had a primary school that no longer have a primary school, where the kids now have to go to the next town, stuff like that. Things that we'd really like to encourage are ways for those kids to be able to walk or bike to school if it's a mile or a mile and a half. And in many cases, they can't do that. And that feels fundamentally wrong and, well, to your point, unequitable. So it's not necessarily just about commuters or adults. It can be about schemes like that.
Mr. Boardman, anything to add in on the challenge?
No, not at all. I mean, we'd like to work everywhere, and I mentioned about providing choices. We can cover the whole country and do it much more equitably with our 50% target, and it will cost 18 billion. Or we can focus on population density, and it will cost 9 billion. They're the choices, and they're not our choices to make. But they are a fact. If we do a rural community, then the value for money in terms of what we have to spend versus what we get in terms of trips developed is going to be lower. I'd absolutely love that, and we should do that. But I think, as Danny suggests, there is a concentration around schools. We're really interested in that. They're often something that gets a lot of local support activity around schools to enable kids to be able to get there. And we know that the traffic in the mornings, 12% of that is the school run. So the impact is much, much bigger. Just to jet steps completely sideways for a second, on things like decarbonisation, the figures used to calculate what moving from a car to riding a bike or wherever they are at the moment, those figures do a like for like. You're doing that, taking that journey from a car and doing it on a bike, and it only credits that. But in my own case, and the reason I raise it is I gave up my car as an experiment, but I was only able to do that because I could do the short journeys, things like to the station, by bike, and I've got safe space to do it. And if I did not have access to that, it's a 30-minute route, I would be driving a car, me. So although we only count on a national level that carbon saving, the carbon saving is actually the fact that I've given up a whole car. And so I think we're underestimating the impact on meeting our climate targets, our commitments, local active travel can actually have. And going back to locally, the school run is part of that. It may be a short journey, a very small bit, but actually it enables people to go down from a 2-car to a 1-car family, which is absolutely huge.
There's a broader point there. Chris
Chris
mentioned the 12% figure, right? So 12% of the traffic at rush hour is school commute. There's a sort of rough average at 50. If you remove 15% of the traffic, you remove 85-90% of the congestion. It's quite a win-win. You get an awful lot more time back for a lot of people if you look at. Scotland's done an incredible job on building links to rural schools, much better than England has done.
And you also see air quality improvements as well along with it. Fantastic. Thank you very much. Chair, back to you.
I see you can come in and dispute that point, Gavin.
No.
Okay.
I'll let it go for now.
Yeah. Can we just ask for 2 final areas? The first is around the inspection function that you have, and then the second is on planning, and I'll hand over, Ruth, to you for planning.
Am I doing
Yeah,
more?
yeah.
Okay, fine.
But I'll do the inspection function bit first.
Oh, you're
of all.
doing the inspection,
Yeah.
right.
So I know it's 5 weeks in, but I just wondered if you actually had any process in place for how you are going to develop your inspection schemes.
Can I just clarify, inspection in terms of everything we deliver, or are you talking in terms of the planning system?
Sorry, no, I mean, forget planning. Ruth will come in there. This is actually the inspection of schemes on completion, and if they've not been completed to design standard, then you would have the powers to withdraw funding for that sort of failure. As I understand it, I mean, you tell me if I'm wrong.
Yeah. So we've got thorough processes in place for. So there are two streams here: things that we fund ourselves directly, things that we influence. So levelling up funds, for example, where we directly fund it, we absolutely have the power to say no more of that. Thank you very much. Where we're influencing, we have the power really to recommend, and then we can work with our colleagues in the DFT or in other departments to say, hold on a minute, these guys promised that they would deliver X and haven't done, you need to take that into account. So that's the broad split.
Logic would dictate it would make sense you had the same powers for both pots.
Yeah, it's a bit of a weak point.
Yeah. Sorry, I interrupted, but yeah.
But you're right.
Yeah.
But the processes are in place. We have a fantastic lead on our inspectorate team, Brian Deegan, who is pretty well known around the country, and he is now, I think, in fact, right now, interviewing for the next 3 roles, and then we're going to be recruiting another 20 people in the next literally couple of weeks.
Are they going to be sort of regional based, or is it more designed?
So it's going to be a blend, actually. The core is going to be based in York, and then we're having at least 3 people per region whose job it is to essentially have their ears to the ground, to be able to work with, collaborate with local communities, to work with local developers, to work with local authorities, and so on, and act as a sort of ears and eyes of the core team.
So they will effectively be sort of, they might cover, say, 4 counties, 5. Yeah, more of a region. Okay, that's interesting. And my understanding also is that those inspections of highway authorities' performance on active travel will influence the funding they receive for other forms of transport. So does that mean effectively if they don't deliver the goods, then that could impact the government funding for bus, for road, etc.?
Well, as it's written down, and when I was on the receiving end, the letters that we got from the Secretary of State in Greater Manchester, then that's absolutely stated the case, that if you do not deliver this aspect, then you will not get your bus money. And I think that is laudable, it is joined up, and it's the right way to do it. We do not have the direct powers to do that. We have the authority at the moment to inspect and work with and try and raise the standards, because ultimately we want people to win, but where they can't, then duty is to inform the partner body responsible for that funding stream and direct them to the directive of the Secretary of State that what action should be taken at this point, but we can't take that action.
And how often are you aware of, as the Secretary of State, actually taken that action as well? As you were saying yourself, you would be under, you could be under that.
How long? Sorry, I missed.
So if ultimately, when you were giving your example in Manchester, that you could be subject to the Secretary of State actually telling you that you'd lost funding because for Manchester, for other transport modes, because you hadn't delivered. And but ultimately, that's, as you say yourself, you can only make the recommendation. It's for the Secretary of State to issue that.
Yes. I only pause because I know that our own structure, the one that Danny is putting in place, and we had in Greater Manchester, we had stage gate funding, exactly the same as a bank does. What do you want to build? That looks fantastic. Here's the money for the foundations. They look great. Here's the money for them. So we have putting in place a mechanism that we can make sure everybody's doing what they said they'd do. And if they've hit a problem, we'll try and help them. And if they don't want to deal with the problem that's been there all along, then we stop. And I think that I would like to see that reflected across the funding streams, but that's not within our gift to do that. That would be the most sensible way to do it and make sure that it stays on track.
And of course, this is all about inspection. But what can be done when local authorities just aren't delivering at all?
Well, in our case, that would count against their next assessment, as in you haven't delivered what you said.
But what if they don't even say? And what if they just don't care enough about active travel that they're just not going to deliver anything? I mean, who can make sure that, if you happen to be, it's a postcode lottery otherwise, who can...
Well, I'm not sure a postcode, it's a leadership lottery perhaps.
Yeah.
But that's not our job to actually force people to behave differently. I think it's really important that we, it's a horrible cliche, but we work with the willing. We haven't got the funds or the capacity, 98 people, or the time to work with people who fundamentally don't believe and don't want to. And so we can't. We will do everything we can to help. And that may include counsellors taking people who are on the fence. And there's an awful lot of, Danny referred to as latent support, where I quite like this, but it's quite scary. Take them somewhere to get that education. We can do that part, but it is not our job to tell a politician what their policy is. But if they want to do this bit, we will help.
No, I mean, I understand your point about you work with the willing. I think, unfortunately, with this committee, we tend to hear a lot of experiences of the unwilling, and actually who can crack that. And actually, I suppose it comes to another sort of part. I mean, as MPs, we have quite a holistic role, so we tend to actually hear of these different problems and sort of a failure to join up locally. And so the classic thing we can hear is you've got a district council that gets Section 106 money for housing. You've got the Highways Authority that would like to put a pedestrian crossing in place but doesn't have the funding, and they don't seem to talk to each other about actually the two could marry up and deliver a solution.
Sure.
You see, I'll just finish my list if I can, Chris. You also see local authorities sometimes consulting to death or over-engineering projects and saying actually it's all too expensive when they could be relatively simple. I remember talking to you in Manchester about some ideas you had. And then we also see the local authority saying, well, we'd like to put this in place, but the DFT rules say that we can't because it wouldn't be 100% safe. And then as MPs, you check in with the DFT, you say, actually, those aren't our rules at all. I list those because I wonder if your agency can actually deliver a solution there, because I know that colleagues across the House struggle with these examples, and we'd like to see someone with a bit more clout get involved.
I think there's 2 points. So finishing up on the previous one, if I may, one of the things that we will be doing, and again this was enacted regionally and quite effective, and I think it could have been enacted more strongly, is that we will publish who's doing what. We will have a map of the country to show who is excelling, who is not interested, and that is very uncomfortable for people who weren't. And where we started in Greater Manchester, when we published a draft map online for consultation, the biggest outrage we got was where's our bit, and that really helps align people because it creates a positive pressure to change. And I think that will be, again, we're just putting the evidence out there, something that Active Travel England can do. and then the local leadership has to own that, whether it's good or it's bad. I think that's important. And in terms of all those barriers, the majority of the people that Danny's employing are coming from those environments. So they know the systems, and they know in some cases how the system's been gamed, and they know what are the real barriers. And the blockers change in different areas. It could be at a leadership level, it could be at an officer level, and then that varied across the 10 districts in Greater Manchester. So we have to be able to change the tools. The first thing is you need to have the conversation to know where it is and try and help and block it. Not sure that fully answers your question. I'm not sure.
Well, it gives me confidence that the culture change is going to shift, and that something is going to move some of those blockers on. So grateful to that. Let's move to the final section, which is planning. The planning system and your role within it, Ruth.
Well, I mean, it absolutely links because it's the disjoint between different players, you're seeing across England, particularly outside, on the edge of and outside towns, housing estates and other developments that just seem to embed car dependency because of the way they're designed and manage to get planning permission. So, and ATE is going to become a statutory consultee for major developments. So, what are your priorities with dealing with the planning system, and where do you see problems in it that are holding back cycling and walking infrastructure and that behaviour change we want to see?
Yep. So you're right. We become a statutory consultee in April next year. We've been working really closely with DLUC on that, and we've been lucky enough that Chris managed to recruit Joanna Avery, who's the chief planner, to help us with our planning on that, and she's been fantastic. We've got two prongs really. One is influencing policy, which is important but has a slightly longer shelf life, obviously, and then the other is essentially supporting the local planning process. So the first thing which I alluded to earlier is that we are test launching the first of our toolkits in about 2 weeks' time. That's going to go to about 24 authorities, I think, and those toolkits are really designed to speed up and help local authorities assess whether development is essentially good or bad on various metrics. I think there's something like 25 or 28 metrics that we're working through, and spits out essentially recommendations and ways to fix those. So that's critical, and we'll launch that in April when we become a StatCon. We're going to be reviewing and triaging any application over 150 units. So we think that's about 3,000 applications a year. Obviously we're not going to do all of those manually, but we're putting in place processes to streamline all of that, and then we'll really engage with and help authorities on the knottier ones of those.
And will you have the resources to be able to deliver that capacity? And that's not, we're only talking about housing developments, but what about other developments? There's other. You have. Being a statutory consultee is more than just ploughing through planning applications, although that in itself is quite a job.
So the way that we're trying to operate, I mentioned earlier the regional teams. Part of the purpose of the regional teams is actually to exercise influence, not just to put a yes or no on a piece of paper, because we're just one of many statutory consultees. Sure. So a really critical part is that we can work locally and try and affect change and bring people together.
I think you make a very good point. The 98 people. I think we've got nearly 300 at Sporting. My other hat. It's a challenge, and then we have to make tough choices, or we have to present the choice we're making to the Secretary of State, and this is what we. So I think Dan and the team have very practically set their threshold of what they can cope with, but proportionality of the team. The secondary challenge with planning is this is the sort of thing that's going to deliver results in over a decade, but our target is 2030. So it's something we have to do for the future, so we don't have the problems we're dealing with now in the future. But it's not something that we're being measured against success-wise. It's a duty and part of the bigger picture. So it's quite a challenge squaring that circle.
Thank you. I'm done on that. I've got one quick other question. Thank you, Chair. Do you know when the Active Travel Fund 4 funding will be announced?
So it's ready to go. We're completely ready. It was approved by Secretary of State. We're waiting for Treasury to sign it off.
Wait for Treasury.
So Secretary of State signed it off. The business plan's in place. Everybody's happy with it. It sits with Treasury at the moment to enact, and then we can give local authorities that confidence.
I would point out again that those local authorities busted up over the summer to enable us to deliver it. So we've got a few phone calls coming in every minute, really.
Thank you.
We're very relieved for London. I'm quite excited to see the rest of the country get its settlements as well.
And is there enough funding in London for the ambition of the local authorities and London Mayor?
Well, £80 million is for the next each year for the next 2 years is quite a lot, but London's set up to spend it. So I think we could always spend more is the cover answer, isn't it?
Okay, thank you very much.
We might want to write to the department to say how exciting it is that London's money is there to be delivered and everyone else has worked incredibly hard, and it would be good to have non-London areas also be able to deliver as well. So can someone sign off, please? Unless there's any other questions or you think we've missed anything, Hal? You've given us an hour and 3/4 worth, so I'd like to hope not. Just want to say thank you to you both. I know it's early days, but it's very exciting listening to the plans you've already made and that you intend to make. As you can probably tell, we have a real determination to sort of get rid of the blockers and actually allow these policies to get delivered to make a difference. So please keep in touch with us if there's anything we should know about as well. It'd be good to have a running dialogue with you, and I wish you both all the very best indeed. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair.
Order.
Meeting has ended. The proceeding 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 has ended.